Alright gang, let's start out here with Chapter 9. Now Chapter 9, it doesn't look like we're dealing with a lot, but it's a lot of information. We're going to configure advanced failover clusters, configure highly available virtual machines, and configure a virtual machine movement. Now, advanced failover clusters, we deal with managing a failover cluster, configuring advanced quorum settings. We talked about this at the end of Chapter 8. Now, failover cluster management tasks are validating a configuration, adding and removing a cluster node, shutting down and restarting a cluster, removing a cluster role, and destroying a cluster, and copying cluster roles. We also move core cluster resources. Now, before you can create a cluster or add servers to an existing cluster, you should run the Validate Configuration Wizard in the Failover Cluster Manager. This, like I said, we just dealt with this at the end of the previous chapter, but we're reiterating it. All right. So here we are. We're validating the configuration wizard. Okay, adding, removing. So here we are, Failover Cluster Manager. We can select the node and go through, and if we want to, we will evict from the node. Okay. Shutting down a cluster stops all cluster roles and the cluster service on all nodes in the cluster. This approach is preferable to stopping the cluster service separately on each node. So here we go. We can shut down the entire cluster. To remove a cluster role, click the roles node, right-click the role, and remove in the Actions pane. All right. So to use the Copy Cluster Roles wizard to migrate clustered services and apps from one cluster to another, there's certain things that you cannot migrate. You can't migrate SQL Server. You can't migrate Exchange Server. You can't migrate Volume Shadow Copy Service Tasks, Task Scheduler, or Cluster Aware Updating Settings. Right? That's just not going to happen. We can't update those. Now, here's our more actions, copy cluster roles. When performing maintenance on a cluster node, move cluster resources from that node to another node in the cluster. Now, core cluster resources include quorum resource, IP address resource that provides the cluster IP address, and network name resource that provides the cluster name. To move core cluster resources, right-click the cluster, point to More Actions, point to Move Core Cluster Resources, and then click the best possible node or select node. Now, it may choose one for you, but you could pick it yourself. Okay. So here we go. We can do the same thing in PowerShell. Here's our commandlets. And it takes a lot of getting used to. Like I said, anytime you can use PowerShell and get comfortable with it. That's a great tool in your tool belt. Now, we can configure advanced quorum settings. Just right-click the cluster in the Failover Cluster Manager, point to More Actions, and then click Configure Cluster Quorum Settings to start the Configure Cluster Quorum Wizard. All right. Once you get in, you got three choices, and here we are. Use default quorum, select a quorum witness, or advanced quorum configuration. Now, if we're going to select a quorum witness, we've got three options when it comes to witness. Here we go. Configure disk witness, configure file share witness, configure cloud witness, and do not configure a quorum witness at all. The advanced quorum configuration option allows you to choose which nodes have a quorum vote in the cluster. By default, all nodes have a quorum vote. You can remove nodes from the voting process. If you remove voting from all nodes, you must have a disk witness. So here we are. We've got all nodes, select nodes, or no nodes. Now, we can have a cloud witness. That's a new quorum witness option that allows you to specify a resource in Microsoft Azure to act as a cluster witness. Now here we are in Azure, and we can go through virtual machines, SQL database. So we've got a lot of resources here when it comes to what we're able to do with Azure. Okay, here we go, pointing to it, standard, disabled, right on down the line. And there we go, there's our cluster. Okay. So we can use Failover Manager to configure cluster quorum settings and the Cloud Witness. There we are. There, we're configuring Cloud Witness. There's the account name, the account key, and the endpoint. Now here we go. We've got that Cloud Witness added to our Failover Cluster Manager. All right. Now, we've got roles for high availability, the DFS, namespace server, DHCP server. It's a ton of things that are cluster awareness roles. There's iSCSI target server, iSCSI server, a file server, DHCP server, ISNS server, messaging queue, virtual machine, Win server. We've got 3 categories of generic applications or services that can be deployed in a failover cluster: a generic app, a generic script, or a generic service. Now, with generic apps and services, cluster software periodically queries Windows to check whether the application or service is still running. Generic apps and servers have fewer ways to let the cluster software know that it is operational state. 2 main options for configuring high availability shares by using the file server role. Default option is file server for general use. It supports standard Windows SMB shares and NFS shares, as well as role services. We've also got the scale out file server for application data option, and it's used for applications that leave files open for extended periods. So here we go. We choose which one we're going to use on a file server type. After you configure it, there we go. Get down even further with it with the available shares and the file and storage services. Now, options when upgrading to a Windows Server cluster: add 2 nodes running Windows Server to the existing cluster. Then you can evict older ones, perform an in-place upgrade. This is all stuff that we dealt with in the last chapter. Okay. Now, if you want to run it in PowerShell, you'd run the update cluster function level PowerShell commandlet to set the operational mode of the cluster to Windows Server 2016 permanently. Now that's upgrading from 2012 R2 up to 2016. Okay. Workgroup clusters and multi-domain clusters have the same requirements. Must have all nodes have running Windows Server 2016, the same roles, same functionality. Have a cluster that's been created using an Active Directory detached cluster, which means you need to use the Administrative Access Point DNS option when creating the cluster with PowerShell. You got to have each cluster node configured with a primary DNS suffix so it can create and find DNS records for the cluster. All servers have to be running at least 2016. Disk controllers have to be SAS and must not have RAID enabled. What else we really need to see? Okay. Configuration of storage replica for cluster-to-cluster replication. Now, we talked about this in Chapter 8, and we're just mirroring our clusters. So essentially what it is, we have 2 identical clusters so that one should fail. We've got another one right there ready to go with everything there. Okay, here we are configuring storage replica. Install Windows Server Backup feature on at least one node. so that you are backing up everything that you can. Now, if we're going to implement stretch cluster requirements, it's the same as any other failover cluster. Stretch cluster node and quorum configuration. The stretch clusters work best if there's an even number of cluster nodes with a cloud witness quorum configuration. Multi-site cluster network configuration. When configuring a multi-site cluster, your network design probably includes multiple IP subnets, at least one physical site. Our data replication options. Windows 2016 server offers storage replica to replicate data between sites. Okay. There's 6 different heartbeat settings that can be configured. We've got same subnet delay, same subnet threshold, cross subnet delay, cross subnet threshold, cross site delay, and cross site threshold. Okay. So, a highly available virtual machine. It allows you to make applications and services highly available by installing them on a virtual machine configured for high availability. Now, to make a VM highly available, you create a failover cluster on 2 or more host computers running Hyper-V role. If you use traditional shared storage, each node in the cluster requires a separate volume for its hosted VMs. So it's redundancy. Now think about that. Highly available. Should anything fail, it's still available. So when we see highly available, we're just looking at redundancy. So that there shouldn't be, even if one gets overloaded, we've got another one picking up the slack. Okay. Okay, to create a highly available VM, use the Failover Cluster Manager, which configures a VM for high availability automatically. Start the new virtual machine wizard, click the Roles node, Actions pane, click Virtual Machines, and then New Virtual Machine. In the first window, choose the target cluster node to host the VM. From that point, the wizard runs normally as though you had just started it in Hyper-V Manager. Here we are. Name that VM, point to the cluster, and we run with it. If VM already exists, move it to a shared storage using the Move option in the Hyper-V Manager. Configure the VM for high availability in the Failover Cluster Manager. Configure Role in the Actions pane to start the high availability wizard. And then in the Select Role window, click Virtual Machine. Select one or more of the VMs and continue the wizard. Now, you've got drain on a shutdown, and the best way to shut down a node in a Hyper-V cluster is to put it in maintenance mode by pausing it and selecting Drain Roles. Now, to pause a node, right-click in the Failover Cluster Manager, point to pause, and then click Drain Roles. Drain on shutdown, that's a feature which drains roles automatically and live migrates the VMs to another cluster, or it's another cluster node, I should say, before the Hyper-V server shuts it down. It's enabled by default on Windows Server 2012 R2 and later. Node Fitness, it's a new failover cluster feature that helps optimize usage of failover cluster node members. And here we are, just balancer, and load balance node when it joins, always load balance, and how aggressive do you want to. And that's enabling automatic balancing of virtual machines. Okay. Now we've got VM resiliency. Windows 2016 has added additional cluster node and VM states to make highly available VMs more resilient. Now, they're unmonitored, isolated, and quarantined. Resiliency is enabled by default, but you can configure various resiliency settings to change default values using PowerShell. Okay, so here we go. Allow apps to communicate through the Windows firewall, whether it's domain, private, or public, and which apps or features will allow. The virtual machine properties, look at policies, response to resource failure. If resources unsuccessful, or if restart's unsuccessful, how are we going to handle it? And we've got guest clustering. Guest clustering requires 2 or more VMs with a guest OS installed on it and configured for failover clustering. Failover clustering occurs in the VM's guest OS. And now here we go, settings for HAVM2 on server DM1. SCSI controller, you can add, then we choose the disk format, whether it's VHDX or a VHD set. Now, methods for moving a virtual machine, we can use Hyper-V replica, live migration, quick migration, storage migration, VM import and export. Now, replica periodically replicates changes in a VM to a mirror VM hosted on another Hyper-V server. Now, if we want to enable replication, go into settings on Hyper-V Manager, click replication configuration in the left pane, and then click enable this computer as a replica server. Okay. So here we go, replication configuration, enable this computer as a replica server. Let me just run right on down. Enabling replication of a virtual machine. Here's our name. Which port are we going to use? Use Kerberos authentication, HTTP, and then we keep going. That's our connection parameters, and we've got to specify those connection parameters. All right. So we've got live migration. It's a Hyper-V feature that enables an administrator to move a VM from one Hyper-V server to another while maintaining the VM's availability. You've got to have 2 or more servers running. You've got to have that redundancy. So it's just like anything. As long as we've got redundancy, if we move one, the other one's got us covered. Okay, types of live migrations. Cluster live migration with SMB shares, shared nothing live migration, and cross-version live migration. Cluster live migrations. The additional requirements for cluster live migrations include 2 or more Hyper-V servers configured in a cluster by using failover clustering feature. Now we keep seeing this over and over again as a requirement for functionalities. Shared storage is set up with CSVs. Select the VM in the Failover Crossover Manager, click Move in the Actions pane, point to Live Migration, and then click Best Possible Node, or you pick your own node. Okay, you can move a VM running Windows Server 2012 R2 to a server running 2016, but the reverse is not possible. It's not backward compatible. Okay, quick migration is available only between Hyper-V servers in a failover cluster. Storage migration is used when you need to move VM storage from one volume to another without moving the VM to another Hyper-V server. You can perform this while a VM is running or when it's shut down. Okay. Now, virtual machine network health protection is a feature that automatically moves a VM from one cluster node to another if a network disconnection is detected. The VM network health detection is configured on the network interface on each VM. To enable this feature or disable it, open the settings for a VM in Hyper-V Manager or Failover Cluster Manager. Click to expand the network adapter, click Advanced Features, and then click Enable or Disable Protected Network checkbox. Okay. And Storage Bases Direct. To begin using Storage Bases Direct, build a failover cluster that meets the requirements, and just go with it. Okay, hyperconverged storage spaces. We see an instance of it here as our storage pool, virtual disks, virtual machines, and then the cluster nodes. Now here's disaggregated direct. And we've got this scale out file server in between. Okay. Cluster management tasks include validating the cluster. You might want to change cluster quorum configuration. Dynamic witnesses is a feature in which cluster determines whether to give the witness a quorum vote. Cloud witness is a new quorum witness option introduced in Windows Server 2016. It uses Microsoft Azure. You can deploy a failover cluster without needing Active Directory for network name management. You can use Windows Server Backup to back up the failover cluster configuration. Virtual machine monitoring allows you to monitor resources, applications, and services running in highly available VMs. Quick migration is migration option available only between Hyper-V servers in a failover cluster. Storage Spaces Direct is a new feature that extends the storage pool concept on a single server to multiple servers in a failover cluster. In Hyper-V Converged Storage Spaces Direct deployment, the storage and the Hyper-V role are part of the same cluster. Right. Now we'll see you in the next chapter. Take your time going through the labs and make sure that you're practicing the flashcards and working that work.